California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, and we are joined again by Mike Spence. He is a council member in West Covina. I want to speak with you about audits. I'm pretty stunned when I heard that you are interested in having the controller of the state of California audit the city of West Covina. That's open in your books, man.
Well, I figure there's a lot of questions about transparency. That's one of the issues that kept coming up during the campaign several months ago, was transparency, and I just got elected, and so I figure what best way to reassure the public or to find out exactly what's going on, what money is being spent, how it's being spent, is it being spent properly, than to have the state controller audit the city of West Covina.
And let's give some background, of course. As we know, there was this small city called Bell in Los Angeles County, not far from you, but far enough, I think it's fair to say, where it became clear that everyone's hand was in the cookie jar. And we know recently the officials that were involved in that wrongdoing are going to jail. So that led to a series of calls for more transparency, more audits, and recently another city, Cudahy. I don't know if they must have voluntarily asked for the audit.
Yeah, the mayor asked for it. The mayor asked for it.
Wow. Be careful what you ask for, because that audit did not go well for Cudahy. What can you tell us about that?
Well, the auditor came back and they found all kinds of problems of self-dealing with council members and developers and the city, and they found a lot of controls weren't there to protect the public's money. And so obviously this is a council that's no longer there, some of them. And so, it made a lot of recommendations on how they need to change doing business there in Cudahy. And but there's been other scandals too, the Sentinel Valley School District, the superintendent. There's been different times now where, different local officials have actually gone to jail. One in Irwindale, Temple City had a bribery one, and there's all kinds of questions about city spending and where all that tax money goes. And I think it's important to reassure residents that their money's being well spent, they're not being ripped off. Elected officials aren't in cahoots with staff to get more money.
Sure. It really begs the question, because we know we have seen a lot of corruption scandals over the last several years. And the common theme in at least some of them is a need to raise money to run for office. And I do not excuse any of the behavior which has been alleged against a variety of elected officials who have used their office to raise money for office. But it does go to a question about whether you're running for the state senate or for West Covina City Council. You need to raise money for a job that doesn't pay that much. And so I wonder if that's something we need to really evaluate and investigate.
Well, I think there is a lot of focus on so-called campaign finance reform. I say so-called because I've seen lots of campaign reform efforts, and it seems like more money gets spent.
Right.
And I think the root cause of that is because government makes so many decisions on what gets built, how it gets built, where it gets built, what kind of businesses can go where. I mean, government makes so many decisions. Everybody feels they have to participate in getting people sympathetic to them elected. And I understand that.
Right. So what's the answer? I mean, land use is one of those areas that cities protect jealously. I mean, they do not want the state to get involved in land use decisions, let alone the federal government. We know what can happen there.
Yeah.
But what's the remedy, if any?
Well, I think the remedy is to be very clear about the process so that everybody has a way of looking at the process and going, okay, this makes sense. This is how it operates. I think too many things are done in the dark. I think sometimes city attorneys are much too strict on telling councils not to release stuff, and then councils don't release it. We've been involved in that in the past. West Covina has been involved. But I think it's better to release more information, let more people have access to information, and I think that gives people a comfort level when they see how the decision was made, that it's not all in the back rooms or at a restaurant late at night.
And what's interesting, it brings up another issue, and that's known as what's called the Brown Act. The Brown Act was passed to increase transparency. What the Brown Act does is it does not allow an elected official to talk to a majority of whatever body in which they are a member on a specific topic. Well, if you're in a city council like West Covina, you have 5 members.
We have 5 members.
That means you can only talk to one other person about a topic. If you talk to another person, meaning not an open council, you violated the Brown Act. Now, I understand why that's the law in terms of transparency, but then what about negotiation? How do you create negotiation if you can't talk to people?
Yeah, negotiations go on in public. And I don't necessarily have a problem with that. My problem with the Brown Act is now it's being used as a defense not to release information.
Explain.
Well, things will happen in closed session, and say, oh, well, I can't tell you what happened in closed session. Or they'll say this is protected by attorney-client privilege. And there's truth to all those things, but at the same time, the council can waive attorney-client privilege with just 3 votes. And actually our city, we did that on a couple document requests that we could have said are protected. We decided to go ahead and release them because to me, it was more important to release them than any type of attorney-client privilege.
But is there a way to create a formula whereby you can engage in a conversation with your colleagues so we don't get to a place where you have to audit a city because no one really knows what happened because you couldn't talk to more than one other person and there was an alleged negotiation, in front of the public, but how do you negotiate on the dais? I mean, that doesn't make sense.
Well, I understand that it's hard, but I don't have a problem with it.
Really?
Because I really do think that if it's done in private, or people think it's done in private,
right,
even if it wasn't, I think that sets up a lot of red flags.
But we know it's done in private at the state because there are 80 members of the assembly, for example, so you'd have to talk to 41, or does it even apply to the state legislature?
The state assembly exempted
they
themselves.
They exempted themselves, right, from the Brown Act.
They exempted themselves, so they don't have to turn over the documents that a city would.
But even so, I mean, they'd have to reach the 41 threshold
right,
to get to the majority.
But that's a different kind of body, though, because a lot of times, it depends on, they're acting as a legislative body, and sometimes councils do that, but sometimes we give direction on administration. And that's a little different because when you're doing stuff on administration, like different permits and things like that, that needs to be done all in public. This isn't a legislative thing that we're talking about our opinion on an issue. Where there's checks and balances. 3 people pass it, it becomes law in that city, and so it's very important that be done in public.
How large is West Covina?
We have over 100,000 people.
It's a nice sized city.
It's a nice sized city.
And compensation for council members?
I think it's $300. I think we get a car allowance or something like that.
Yeah. So that also kind of begs the question. You're doing great work, presumably, and you're getting paid as if you're a volunteer. Now, I understand the argument on one side that it is public service, but on the other side, how is one supposed to do their best work if they have to hold another job while also being a city council member of a city that is a fairly big size?
Yeah, well, I think it's a reality check. I think it's important that I have other jobs or that I participate in other things
fair enough.
in order to understand what actual people do. I think too many elected officials live in a bubble where they don't know what everybody else has to do.
No, I hear you.
And that's why you hear proposals sometimes that don't make any sense because they don't live in the real world. So I think I don't have a problem with it.
Part of the reason for that, as I understand it, is it was part of the, quote, progressive era, and you have professionals running cities, and that's the city manager.
Yes.
But does that then create a scenario whereby the electeds don't really know what's going on? It's the city manager that's really running the city, and he or she has his own fiefdom, a la what happened with Robert Rizzo and Bell.
Yeah, well, I think there's definitely those kinds of problems, but I think, compared to all the other systems, it's a good system where we have professionals that do certain functions, and then there's a council that gives direction and represents the community and tells staff what to do.
And that's really, I think, the key, is that in these small to mid-sized cities, the council is not running the city as you think of a large city like Los Angeles or San Francisco or San Diego. It's giving direction. You're almost like a board of directors almost, and you have your CEO, meaning the city manager, running the day-to-day.
Yeah, I think that's a good comparison. But even in cities like LA, they have a professional people running the city. They're not the council members, even though they're full time.
Right.
They're not running the city, and so they're still giving direction and making policy and those kinds of things as well. And so that's the system we have, and I think that's better than a system that lets the professionals run everything, or starts paying people full time to be council members, to be out there in the public.
So assuming your council goes forward with an audit, requesting an audit, I should say, from the controller, what do you think is going to happen?
Well, if we do it, I think whatever happens is people will know what the facts are. And to me, that's the most important part. No matter what happens, they'll know that things are being run great, or this can be done better, or whatever. The important thing is just to get the truth and the facts out there. To me, that's most important.
His name is Mike Spence. He is a council member in the city of West Covina. My name is Brad Pomerance, and this is Charter California Edition. It's Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance. She is back. She is Janet Chin. She is a member of the Garvey School Board, and I want to speak with you about what's known as transitional kindergarten. As you may know, a few years back, we changed the date with which students would enter kindergarten. We made it later. So now there's a question, should we add a year after we made it later for this transitional kindergarten period? The Democrats in the Assembly and the Senate support it. The governor is a little cautious. What do you think?
Well, I think that, as you know, we are trying to get kids to meet many of the challenges and many skills by the time they graduate high school. And so public education really needs to start earlier. And there are parents on one side that say that they prefer the kids to have a little bit more time, but there really is no time. I mean, we really need to make sure that kids get started as soon as possible.
It's interesting, a field poll came out recently, and I'm not sure if you saw it, and it indicated that Californians were willing to incur the cost that would be necessary to launch a TK program, which, look, Californians have been generous in the past, but this program would cost, I mean, it could be $1 billion a year when it fully rolls out. Is now the time to look at creating that program? One could argue, yes, because we're flush with money, but we may not be in a few years.
If not now, then when is always the conversation in education. And yes, it's going to cost more, but I think that California, and we're kind of on the momentum right now where Californians are supporting education. And so anything that can get our kids further and faster, we definitely need to make sure that those kinds of things happen.
So how is the fiscal state of California education, using Garvey as an example? I mean, we do hear Prop 30 helped. We do hear that just generally receipts are up because of an improving economy. Are you seeing that on the ground?
Garvey's very unique in the sense that, being kind of in the core of the San Gabriel Valley, we are about 56% Asian and then 43% Latino. And so we have higher needs. Title I, we have economic aid, we've got
LCFF.
LCFF, and LCFF actually makes Garvey look so much better and brighter, on the budget. So we're...
but let's talk about that.
Okay.
Is it really a sea change? I mean, is this year just so different from last year?
Not so much this year. We will see the changes next year.
Okay.
And so in the preparation of getting, parents involved and all this community involvement as to how we're going to be spending this money, things are looking good.
And
we're excited about it.
And if we can, I want to talk about what parents are telling you.
Okay.
As you know, there's something called the LCAP, which is the Local Control Accountability Plan. Okay, thank you. And it requires stakeholder involvement. And so as I understand it, Garvey, like any school district, is talking to stakeholders, having meetings. What are your parents telling you? How do they want the local control funding formula funds to be spent?
Well, we have a committee that's going to be created with management and our administration so that those guidelines, we're going to give the parents some kind of guideline as to what our mission and our goals and what our values as a community are. The parents want more funding for libraries.
They do.
They would like to see more arts programs. They don't exactly know what needs to be happening within the curriculum, but in general, they have a good sense of what they would like their kids to have. And most of it stems around enrichment programs and things that are not so much core to the curriculum, but they do want their kids to have a sense of the feeling of academic achievement. They want the children to, as they compare to other kids and other school districts, they want to make sure that their kids are advancing a little bit quicker than most. Music classes might be one, science definitely.
And are you permitted to create these, I'll call them non-core programs, under LCFF? We know that LCFF gives school districts more discretion, but at the same time, LCFF bumps, which Garvey is receiving because you educate more English language learners, economically disadvantaged children. That's supposed to be dedicated, those funds, to those children. But then again, I mean, how do you determine whether this music program is benefiting those children. They could benefit everyone.
Well, I think the weight is kind of put on the measurement of whether or not our programs will help all students.
Right.
The parents, from the parents' frame of mind, we have to focus them on what our priorities are. And once we lay out those priorities, then we can start saying, well, what kinds of programs would you really like to see? So it's more of an education for the parents first before we ask them, well, what kind of
right.
things would you like to see in the actual programming?
When you look at Garvey, is that district more heavily weighted towards English language learners or economically disadvantaged?
We're about 46% English language learners.
That's a big number.
Yes, we're a high immigrant community.
And is it a high number of Asian immigrants who speak Asian languages or Latino immigrants speaking Spanish?
Both. We have both.
So how do you, I mean, that's a tremendous challenge. I mean, usually when you look at a school district, if there is English language learners, it tends to be that they're dominant in one language. Could be Spanish, could be whatever it is. But you have a very different scenario.
Well, on top of that, we also have different Asian languages.
Of course, right.
Mandarin, Cantonese, Vietnamese being the more predominant. Right. And so, yeah, it creates more challenge, but I think that our parents at Garvey really do care about the kids' education in general, whether it be Latino or the Asian
Sure.
populations.
You mentioned that the Garvey parents would like to see academic achievement. One of the ways that academic achievement is gauged is through what we know as standardized tests. Like it or not, that's one way that we see academic achievement. We know as a result of the adoption of Common Core, which is happening throughout California and 44 other states, that we're going to have new standardized tests that are not as much kind of No Child Left Behind, Drill and Kill, but looking for knowledge that is more, not quite as thin and deeper. Those tests are rolling out now, completely different than what kids have seen in the past. What's the buzz on the street?
It's going to be very difficult because this is applied learning and the students.
What does that mean? I know.
Children have to prove that their answers.
Right.
It's not just about reading and then being able to choose between A, B, C, or D.
Right.
It really is about how do you know that your answer is correct? Where is the proof in the reading or in your own research that you can show that this is the correct answer?
I have to say this. As a father, I think that's fantastic.
Sure.
But if my child hasn't been taught to think and learn that way, and then all of a sudden they're presented with a test that seeks that acumen, how are they going to do it?
It's a very big challenge.
Yes.
And it's a very big challenge for our staff and our teachers currently
Sure.
now. One of the tests, actually, my own child had taken a test
Right.
recently, and
This new test.
This new test,
Right.
and it gives you a range. It's a math question, but it gives you a range. It doesn't give you the exact answer, and you actually have to figure out what range. You actually need to know all the fundamentals of how to get to the answer, and then on top of that, prove that answer in order to make a decision as to which one of those would be
In
correct.
the range.
In the range.
It's not the answer.
It's not the answer.
What did your child say?
He's very confused.
What about on the language arts side? What have you heard as a mom about the new test? Did it also throw them for a loop?
Sure, it did. I'm actually very curious. I haven't actually taken the test, but you can actually go into the Common Core and take a sample test and try to figure it out for yourself.
I think I told you this. I'll say this on the air. I recently took one SAT section in language arts and one in math. Now, this is the old SAT. We know the new SAT is being revamped.
Yes.
On the English section, I got 100. Not bad.
Very
On the
good.
math section, I got a 0. I could not answer one math question. What does that tell you? Who knows what it tells you? Her name is Jenna Chin. She is a trustee at the Garvey School District. I'm Brad Pomerance. It's Charter California Edition. It's Charter California Edition. I'm Brad Pomerance, and we are joined by Nancy Nyman Auerbach. She is a professor at Scripps College. Her specialty, at least to me, is fascinating. It deals with food and the politics of food. You know, here we are in California, especially in kind of middle-class suburban areas. We don't realize that there are places, even in our state, where food is just not available in the way we may think it's available.
Right.
Explain that if you can.
Yeah, so food politics people call those food deserts,
Right.
Places where there's an abundance of processed foods, of fast food, but not a lot of availability of fresh produce, grocery stores, the kind of places where you could make a healthy meal.
If you drive through significant portions of South Los Angeles,
Yeah.
you will see what you are describing.
Absolutely.
Bona fide food deserts. I mean, they have every fast food restaurant you can imagine, and yet if you look for a grocery store, it's difficult to find.
Yeah.
How does that happen?
Well, I mean, there's been, I think it's a combination of corporate policy and government policy, right? There's been a systematic disinvestment from our inner cities, and, you know, grocery stores have been pulling out as they think it's not profitable.
But I mean, look, I understand that maybe some of the, quote, higher end grocery stores
Yeah.
may not want to have businesses in socioeconomically disadvantaged areas, regardless of race or
Right.
color or whatever it may be. But just general mainstream markets, people need to buy food. Why wouldn't they be everywhere?
Yeah, you would think, right? But, you know, if you're making a decision about where to put a store, part of it has to do with, you know, what is the perceived safety of that neighborhood? What is the, you know, they do analyses on what the average income level is in order to know, you know, how much they're going to pull in. So, I mean, part of it is, you know, to what extent can we control that outcome? I think that is a sign of a deeper problem, right? And the deeper problem is that, you know, fast food is significantly cheaper than fresh produce, and it's significantly cheaper. It's not an accident, right? I mean, government policy, the subsidization of corn and soy, you know, through the Farm Bill actually makes that food cheaper. It's not natural that it's cheaper, and the lobbying power of those corporations is huge. So you've got a combination of political and economic power, which is why I teach political economy, which is why food is a natural lens to look at those kinds of power differentials.
Recently, we heard of a controversy brewing in New York City. And I think it's really a great kind of case study
Yeah.
when you look at food and food politics. And that dealt with, I mean, I hope it's okay I use this term, the big gulp.
Yeah,
The big gulp.
the soda ban.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which I admit, I enjoy the big gulp sometimes.
Sure.
But talk to us about the controversy surrounding the big gulp.
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets to one of the core issues I like to talk about in my classes, which is, you know, in this country, often political debates center around this issue of choice and freedom
Right.
on the one hand, and that has been a massive, you know, there's been a massive attack on, you know, you can't tell us what to, you know, it's paternalistic, the government should get out of our decision making.
1984.
Yeah, but on the other hand, I think those of us who are really concerned about these sort of food justice inequities start from the position that we think we're free, but we're already not. Right? The fact is that when corporations have the amount of power to change the relative costs of food, to have advertising, to get our kids hooked from the time that they're 3 years old, to get sodas in schools, to right, all of those things that we're already not free individuals, right? And so some of that issue, I like to sort of change the nature of that question of should the government decide or should we decide? That's not really the question. The question is, should we look at some of the underlying power dynamics?
In New York, the big gulp was banned, but the ban was overturned.
Yes, it was.
What did you make of that? I mean, no, you're not a lawyer.
Yeah.
But you know, talk to us about that.
So this is my take on it. I was actually asked, you know, was this a huge disappointment for the food justice movement? Was it a failure? And I actually don't think so, because I don't actually think the point was to get the ban.
Right.
I actually think that by bringing so much attention to this issue, right, that's part of it, is to make people see what's going on. And also it changes the relative cost benefit analysis for corporations, right? If it's worth it for them to externalize their costs onto the health of folks, right, especially low-income people of color, then they will continue to do it. But the more light that is shined on this, the less corporations are actually willing to go there. So I actually think, same thing with the GMO debate in this state. It
Genetically
lost.
modified, right.
Yeah, genetically modified foods, right? The labeling, there was a move to try to get labeling on, all genetically modified foods. That failed, but I actually don't think that was a failure. I think it made corporations spend so much money fighting that proposal.
But let me ask you, I don't know if this is an area you've explored, but I would think that in some cases GMOs are a net positive. Am I wrong, especially when you think about food justice?
So, yeah, I mean, this is a major debate, right, between the scientists who say, no, you shouldn't be Luddites. There's a
Right.
way in which technology can work for us. I'm a political economist, right? So my issue is not, I don't even pretend to know whether or not it's safe in all areas, where it's safe, where it's
Right.
not. But I do know the political economy of this question, right?
And?
And large corporations like Monsanto
Right.
are able to use the technology in ways that really are, I think, fundamentally problematic for our democracy, right? So the ways in which, first of all, to be able to say we shouldn't even have these foods labeled and to be able to win there, right? To be able, it encourages monocultures all over the world.
When you say monocultures, meaning?
So the planting of a single crop where there used to be diverse crops. And there scientists are very clear on the negative aspects of that, right? Because it brings new pests, it brings pests that are resistant to the kind, it encourages the use of more pesticides. So, there are ways in which there's an economics of the use of genetically modified organisms that makes it so that it's not necessarily whether the genetic modification is a problem or not, but it does allow for further monopolization to go on, and that kind of political and economic concentration of power is a problem.
What about with our friends to the south in Mexico, when you think about food justice?
Yeah.
I mean, I know you've looked into this issue generally. What
Yeah.
can you tell us about how that issue plays out to the south?
Okay, so this is probably the key example of interconnectedness in
right.
political economy of food. So NAFTA gets passed
Right.
and opens
North
up
America Free Trade Agreement.
Exactly, and it opens up the border for U.S. farmers to be able to sell corn,
Right.
especially corn, in Mexico, right? And Mexican farmers get systematically put out of business. And you might think, well, that's because we're just more efficient, right? But the fact is, NAFTA was passed requiring the Mexican government to stop subsidizing the Mexican ejidos, the cooperative farms, but it did not require any change in the Farm Bill in the U.S. So what you have is U.S. subsidized corn competing with unsubsidized Mexican corn. All of those farmers in southern Mexico start to lose their livelihood. That's when we get a big immigration wave, right? And then all of a sudden we have an immigration crisis, right? So, and that immigration crisis now creates a bunch of people in vulnerable conditions that are having to work, with pesticides, with all kinds
How
of.
did this happen? That we didn't have to lift our protective barriers and they did, or whatever. Politics.
We have relatively more power than Mexico, right? We're negotiating a trade agreement. The size of the U.S. market gives us a tremendous amount of power.
Her name is Nancy Nyman Auerbach. She is a professor at Scripps College in food politics, food economy. My name is Brad Pomerance, and this is Charter California Edition.